won't hear this on the radio.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. Is the price worth it? The price, we think the price is worth it.
Listen, I really think the media is...
Because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club.
Could you look me in my eyes and just lie to me?
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
They burn these fucking people alive because the message they want to convey to you is state power will always win.
You're listening to Below the Tension Podcast.
Open up your eyes, 'cause maybe it's our lies. I'm trying to make them break.
How's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on this Saturday edition of the show. We have a lot of great news lined up for you, and the title of this podcast is going to be News You Missed During the Dallas Shooting. I tend to do this not only because of the format of the show, normal news cycles, stories that you probably didn't see just on a normal news day. It's even more important that I do these shows during major news events such as what happened the other night. The news cycle is so inundated with that sensational story that a lot of things get missed in the fray. I'm going to talk about that briefly, but in a different way. I'm going to talk about the state of the world as a whole, and then talk about taking a middle road on some of these issues, and that it seems like we just can't do that, but we should. Now, this podcast is syndicated by Voices of Liberty, a Ron Paul pet project. It's also syndicated by the Sovereignty Network, a community of journalists and content creators reporting the revolution of the mind. You can see my personalized webpage on their website, sovereigntynetwork.com/belowthetension, and I am also syndicated by timetofree.us, a new community of anarchists. Check out this podcast, visit their website, or tweet them at timetofreeus to find out more information. Now, as I was precluding to, everyone knows what happened in Dallas the other night. I want to put into perspective the state of the world, because even though the media makes it seem like it's not this way, we are living in the most peaceful time in human history, undoubtedly. A study by Tel Aviv University proves that. And violence, not just war, but violence altogether, is down dramatically, especially if you look back centuries and centuries and centuries. But even in the past century, violence overall, crime, war, murder, is all down on all metrics. And I wanted to drive that home because it seems like everything is so violent nowadays, but it's not the case. I wanted to read a couple of bullets from the study. Violence against women, rates of rape and sexual assaults against intimate partners have been sinking for decades, and now a quarter or less of their peak in the past. Violence against children, kids are undoubtedly safer than they were in the past. Declines were particularly large for assault victimization, bullying, and sexual victimization. Genocide and other mass killings of civilians. The trend line of genocide and other civilian killings, fortunately, pointed sharply downward. After a steady rise during the Cold War until 1992, the proportionality of states perpetrating or enabling mass killings has also plummeted. War. In a historically unprecedented development, the number of interstate wars has plummeted since 1945. And the most destructive kind of war, in which great powers and developed states fight each other, has vanished altogether. Incredible. The end of the Cold War also saw a steep reduction in the number of armed conflicts of all kinds, including civil wars. And last point here, though the recent increase in civil wars and battle deaths is really real and worrisome, it must be kept in perspective. It has undone the progress of the last dozen years, but the rates of violence are still well below those of the 1990s and nowhere near the levels of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So not only this last century, but this last decade, 2 decades, just in the last 2 decades have seen violence across all metrics plummet. So keep that in mind when you watch the news, that it is bad. Obviously any tragedy is bad, but if you think about just a couple of 100 years ago, a line of thousands of guys lined up against another line of thousands of guys, and they all just smashed into each other until everyone was dead on one side or the other. Just look at World War II. We firebombed entire cities in Germany and Japan. Dresden was burnt to the ground. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Not to mention Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands instantly vaporized. And now we do targeted strikes, precision strikes, with laser and GPS guided weapons. And even though civilians get killed in some of these events, it's less than 100. And when you think about just 50, 60, 70 years ago, how nations conducted war, it's incredible. And also one other point I want to make, keeping things in perspective in the light of the Dallas shooting and other incidents, is that the United States is an oligarchy and not a democracy, proven by Princeton University. The U.S. is dominated by the rich and powerful elite. So concludes a recent study by Princeton University. From the study, a multivariate analysis indicates the economic elites in this country represent business interests, have a substantial impact on U.S. policy, while the average person's mass-based interest groups have little to no effect. In English, the article goes on, the wealthy few move policy while everyone else has little power. 2 professors came to this conclusion after 1,779 surveys asked between 1981 and 2000 about policy issues. It's a really interesting study. It's a long read, obviously, but they have it publicly available on the Princeton website. Very interesting how they came to those conclusions. One in particular, they showed public opinion, and then they showed corporate or banking opinion on certain issues. And as far as how Congress voted, it was about 1/3 of the time almost dead on. You had a 1 in 3 chance of a congressman voting how you liked or how you would vote. Whereas the business interest, corporate banking interest, versus how Congress voted was very in line with each other. As the peaks go up and the peaks go down, the Congress follows a lot more than, basically a crapshoot. So, talking about that and about this Dallas shooting and all the stuff that we've had happen, it seems like you can't be middle of the road with anything nowadays. It seems like you either have to be 100% pro-cop or 100% Black Lives Matter or whatever the case may be, the opposite side of that. You can't say, and for instance, the Alton Sterling shooting, where in the Baton Rouge shooting, where to me, I can see both sides, but that's not acceptable to the pro-cop or anti-cop people. If I was the cops and I got called to a call where a guy threatened somebody with a gun and he was resisting somewhat, I saw the 2 taser pops. It didn't really affect him, so they tackled the guy. You can see his right hand is pinned by the cop on his knee, but that left hand, he keeps jerking it back from him. I'm not saying that the cops should have just went ahead and shot him, but the dude's acting suspicious. You got called on him because somebody said he had a gun. What are you supposed to think? But at the same time, I don't think they should have just popped him 4 times right there on the ground. But at the same time, you can't see what the out and left hand is doing. So my thing is that, okay, it was shady, but at the same time, the guy was acting shady too. Both people did something wrong. But that doesn't seem like that's acceptable to some people. You can use logic and common sense in coming up with opinions on issues. Especially in police interactions, every situation is unique. And to question whether the cops were justified, you're automatically hating on cops. Or to say that, maybe what Alton was doing was shady, you're blaming the victim. No, that's not what I'm saying. But there are other cases that are more clear-cut one way or the other than that. But when you get something like this, where it's just, I don't know, that's unacceptable, but that's the way it should be. Now, moving on to some news relating to the Dallas shooting, which you may have seen. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick calls Dallas protesters hypocrites for running from snipers' bullets. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick of Texas called protesters who ran away from a hail of bullets that rained down on downtown Dallas on Thursday night hypocrites. Quote, "All those protesters last night, they turned and ran the other way, expecting the men and women in blue to protect them. What hypocrites!" An audibly emotional Patrick said. "We have their back," Patrick said of police, "and I'm sick and tired of those who are protesting our police and putting their lives in danger. I do blame the social media with their hatred. I do blame Black Lives Matter protesters. This has to stop." Well, I got news for you, you fucking idiot. That has nothing to do with each other. If people start shooting, I'm running, and I don't expect anyone to run towards it. First of all. And second of all, we're just supposed to just accept everything that the police departments do in this country. The one group of people that engages sometimes violently with our public, citizens of the United States, we should just never ever protest them ever? Is that what you're suggesting? Anyone that calls into question police conduct doesn't deserve to not be shot by a sniper? I understand you're upset, but you're a fucking idiot. Moving on to some news you may have missed. State Department to restart internal review of Clinton's email use. The U.S. State Department will restart the internal investigation into former Chief Hillary Clinton's email use, now that the Justice Department has declined to pursue charges. The State Department review could potentially lead to certain sanctions against Clinton, including disciplinary action. Probably not, considering what are you going to do? She doesn't work there anymore. What are you going to do? Like, put a nasty gram in their file? Ugh. when she becomes the president, what's that going to matter? Congresswoman charged with fraud in charity scam. Oh. A congressman, woman, whatever, a crook? What? I wonder who she pissed off that she got hemmed up with this. U.S. Representative Corrine Brown of Florida and her chief of staff have been charged with multiple counts of fraud and other federal offenses in a grand jury indictment unsealed Friday after a federal investigation into fraudulent charity with ties to the congresswoman. Brown, a Democrat, was to appear Friday in Jacksonville federal court on charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and filing false tax returns. She has represented a Jackson-based congressional district since 1993. The indictment comes after an investigation into the charity One Door for Education Foundation, which federal prosecutors say was purported to give scholarships to poor students, but instead filled her coffers and the coffers of her associates. Yeah, a black congresswoman supposed to be giving scholarships to underprivileged black kids, but just stuffing it in her pocket. Awesome. That's just great. And on to some potentially paradigm-shifting news. Jill Stein has invited Bernie Sanders to take over the Green Party ticket. Quote, I've invited Bernie to sit down and explore collaboration. Everything is on the table. If he saw that you can't have a revolutionary campaign and a counter-revolutionary party, he'd be welcome to the Green Party. He could lead the ticket and build a political movement. I would step aside. She said that she made the offer to Sanders over email at the end of the primary season. However, she has not received the response yet. The move comes just days before Sanders is expected to endorse Hillary Clinton. That is probably not going to happen, considering that Hillary Clinton and the DNC is capitulating to a lot of his platform demands. So I doubt that he will take that offer. But if he did, and this became a four-way race, that would be an incredible historical moment. But I kind of doubt it'll happen. But here's for hoping. Now on to some foreign policy news. U.S. and South Korea agree to deploy THAAD missile defense system. U.S. and South Korean military officials have said they are ready to deploy an advanced U.S. missile defense system in South Korea to cope with North Korean threats, a move likely to raise strong objections from Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang. It already has. They are very, very upset with this. South Korea's defense ministers of policy said that Seoul and Washington would quickly deploy the system because of North Korea's growing weapons capabilities pose a big threat to the region. Now, from what I understand, THAAD is a completely defensive system. And the same within Eastern Russia. I don't particularly understand why that's such a big deal to other countries if it's completely defensive. The only thing that I can think of is that it messes up the deterrent ability of the other country. And basically, if it came down to it, if we could shoot down all of Russia's ICBMs, but they couldn't shoot down ours, and we knew that, and they knew that, it would change the dynamic of power. That's the only thing I can really think of that they would be so upset about that for. Which makes sense. On to some always developing Venezuela news. And if you remember last week I covered a story about how Maduro was saying, everything's getting better, I'm turning back on the electricity, or stop the rationing, the dam is filled, everything's fine. Hundreds of Venezuelan women stormed the border in search of food. Hundreds of Venezuelan women rushed through the border of Colombia in search of basic goods amid the country's ongoing economic crisis. The BBC reports about 500 women stormed the border between Venezuela and Colombia, hoping to bring back food and other items. They purchased a number of goods, including paper, flour, cooking oil, corn flour, and other goods, which have become difficult to find in Venezuela. Basic shit. And here's the kicker. Due to the exchange rate between the two countries, the goods the women gathered in Colombia cost them nearly 10 times as much as it would have cost in Venezuela. Good job, socialism. Now that's all I had for you guys today. It was very difficult to find any meaningful news stories below the tension of this Dallas shooting. Maybe because it was just slow other than Dallas. I'm not sure. And you can always tweet me at Slav Libertarian if there is a story that you feel didn't get as much attention as it should. You can also check out the show on iTunes below the tension, YouTube below the tension, Facebook below the tension. Thank you guys for listening and have a great weekend.